Hi, this is Scott Kirzner, and I'm going to read four of my favorite pieces from the new collection, Innovation Economy, True Stories of Startups, Flameouts, and Inventing the Future in New England. The Story of an Acquisition in a Fishbowl. This was published in the Boston Globe, June 9th, 2013. This is the story of Puffer, a sprightly little pufferfish who lived in an office building in Cambridge. Puffer was the mascot of a company called Endeca. Every day when the software developers would show up for work on the 15th floor, the first thing they would see when they got off the elevator was Puffer swimming happily in her tank. All the employees loved Puffer. They put her picture on posters that promoted company-wide parties. And when she puffed up, which was not very often, people took pictures and emailed them to their coworkers. The employees who helped take care of Puffer, feeding her krill and algae, loved her even more. She would follow them whenever they walked past her tank, sometimes bonking into the glass. But one day in 2011, one of the richest men in the world decided to buy Endeca. He paid more than $1 billion for the company, which created software to help businesses analyze their operations or organize the products sold on their websites. And that's when things changed for Puffer and her friends. This is the story of Puffer, but it's also the story of those 1,000 tiny changes that big companies often make when they acquire smaller ones, and about how those changes often lead to the loss of the very same talent the big company hoped to bring on as part of the deal. Puffer wound up at Endeca through happenstance. The fast-growing company was subletting a new office in East Cambridge in 2001, and the prior tenant had a few things they were trying to sell us, recalls Ken Papa, Endeca's former head of facilities. We got their pool table, their security system, a reception desk, their saltwater fish tank, and 6 fish for about $5,000. No one remembers the other fish, but Puffer became this cult legend at the company, says Papa, whose brother Steve founded Endeca. When we had a party, she'd be on the posters, wearing a sombrero and drinking a Corona, says Ken Papa. When the company moved, first to Alewife and then to Kendall Square, Puffer came too in a 5-gallon pail. In October 2011, the California tech giant Oracle, run by billionaire Larry Ellison, announced it would acquire Endeca. Most of the company's administrative employees, including Ken Papa, were told that they would no longer be needed after Endeca was integrated into Oracle. I knew I was losing my job, Papa says, but I helped them out as best I could. One day, in a meeting with Oracle executives overseeing the integration of the two companies, they mentioned that Oracle has a no animals policy at its offices. Papa tried to persuade Oracle to leave the fish tank alone. It cost about $5,000 a year to have a vendor come in to clean the tank and deliver Puffer's food. My advice was, if they took the puffer fish, it was going to make them look like bad guys, Papa said. But they didn't heed my warnings. The vendor helped Papa find another home for Puffer. In January 2012, Papa sent out an email letting everyone know it was Puffer's last day at the company. Some came to say goodbye, but others said they couldn't bear to watch. The tank just gathered dust. Then someone drew a picture of Puffer on the glass with a permanent marker. The tank sat there empty as a reminder of the Endeca that was, says Rob McDonald, a former Endeca engineering director. Plenty of other things changed at Endeca, many much more significant. Steve Papa no longer ran the company, and there were more layers of management, says Steve Fredette, who oversaw Endeca's mobile products. The old formula for calculating end-of-year bonuses, which everyone understood, was altered, and it became fuzzier and unknown, says McDonald. There were new policies about which specific snacks and sodas could be stocked in Endeca's kitchen. But among all the changes, Puffer's disappearance was the most visible. When employees announced that they were leaving, the fish often came up in their exit interviews. I know it seems like a silly thing, says Rob Gonzalez, a former product manager at Endeca, but the puffer fish was part of the family. Endeca's 150 or so engineers were the company's crown jewel. They wrote the software and knew how to maintain it and make it better. Many of them stuck around for a while after the acquisition, trying to give it a shot, even though they didn't consider themselves big company people, says Fredette. But when McDonald and other ex-Endecans looked at an old employee list recently, they calculated that about 2/3 of the engineers had split since the Oracle purchase. Some, like Fredette, have started their own companies. McDonald is working for a Cambridge data analytics startup, Hadapt. Oracle declined to comment on anything related to Endeca or its policies pertaining to fish. Puffer moved to a retirement center, the Fall River Jewish Home, where she lived out her final days. She passed away peacefully around Christmas of last year, says Ed Warman, owner of Aquavision, the vendor that took care of Puffer's tank. Ken Papa knew that, but when a bunch of Endeca alumni got together last month for a Cinco de Mayo party, he didn't have the heart to tell them. Even for that party, Puffer's face was on the poster. Oracle eventually decided to make an exception to its policy about animals, according to former Endeca employees. Perhaps a belated attempt to revive the team's esprit de corps? Oracle wouldn't say. There's a new saltwater tank in the middle of the office where the engineers work, but no Puffer. The Mystery of the Last Candy Factory, published in the Boston Globe May 4th, 2018. On the walk from Kendall Square into Central Square, you'll pass the last remaining candy factory in Cambridge. It's a boxy cream-colored building with opaque windows. A small sign out front whispers that the facility, Cambridge Brands, is owned by Tootsie Roll Industries. You need sharp eyes to read it from the far side of Main Street. For a few years now, I've wanted to unwrap the mystery of the Cambridge Brands factory and find a way to get inside. I succeeded at one of those goals. My starting point? Everyone in Cambridge assumed that the factory probably made Tootsie Rolls or Tootsie Pops, or maybe both, given its corporate parentage. And the small sign incorporates Tootsie's familiar white, red, and brown color scheme. For the first half of the 20th century, Cambridge was the rich, creamy center of the nation's candy industry. Factories cranked out Charleston Chews, Necco wafers, Squirrel Nut zippers, Sugar Daddies, and an array of chocolates and cookies, including the Fig Newton. According to the Cambridge Historical Society, 1946 was the apex of the city's candy-making era, with 66 different companies dotted around Cambridge. At the time, the area in which Cambridge Brands is located was known as Confectioner's Row. The Cambridge Brands facility was built in 1927 by the James O. Welch Company, which invented Sugar Babies, Sugar Daddies, and Sugar Mamas, all caramel-intensive treats. Welch was eventually acquired by Tootsie Roll Industries in 1993. In the second half of the 20th century, the candy industry consolidated. Manufacturing moved out of the city, and many of the dustier brands fell out of fashion. Still, even in the early 1980s, my first memory of the neighborhood was how sweet it smelled, Gus Rankatori remembers. The Necco factory was still making candy, and I think 2 other factories were still in business. Rankatori was a co-founder in 1981 of Toscanini's Ice Cream, whose original location is diagonally across the street from Cambridge Brands. But Rankatori told me that he'd never been inside the factory. "Wish I could be more helpful," he said. I asked the public relations representatives of Tootsie Roll Industries, headquartered in Chicago, whether anyone could tell me about the factory in Cambridge, or perhaps give me a glimpse inside. I waited and called and emailed again. I rang up the CEO's office and left a message. I read everything I could about Tootsie Roll Industries, which the Wall Street Journal described in 2012 as a secret empire. It's a publicly traded company. The stock is down about 20% over the last year, but does the bare minimum of publicity. The company has 2,000 employees, and the Cambridge factory is the smallest production facility it owns. 2 years ago, there was a rare accident at the Cambridge factory. A candy wrapping machine severed a worker's fingertip, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration levied a $46,000 fine for workplace safety and training violations. I eventually tracked down one person who'd been inside the factory, Jeff Lemberg, a Curry College communications professor who wrote a 2002 story about it for the Globe, just before Halloween. "I was hoping to find chocolate rivers and Oompa Loompas," Lemberg said, "but it was just a bland factory run by a small team of Central American women in hairnets. The noise from the machinery was so loud that everyone wore earplugs." Lemberg also happened to meet the CEO and COO of Tootsie Roll Industries, Melvin and Ellen Gordon, who gave him a personal tour. By coincidence, Lemberg explained, they just happened to be in town from Chicago. Actually, it turns out that the top 2 executives of Tootsie Roll Industries live part-time in Wellesley, and had strong ties to the area. Melvin College was born in Dorchester and earned degrees from Harvard College and Harvard Business School. Ellen Gordon studied at Wellesley College and earned a degree at Brandeis. The Gordons had overseen acquisitions that included Dots Gumdrops, Charms Blow Pops, Double Bubble Gum, and Andy's Chocolate Mints, as well as the purchase of the Cambridge Brands facility in 1993. While the company is headquartered in Chicago, the Gordons seem to spend a good deal of time in Wellesley. Tootsie Roll Industries paid about $12,500 a month to rent them an apartment in the Windy City, and between $800,000 and $1.2 million on their private jet transportation, according to SEC filings. When Melvin died 3 years ago at age 95, Ellen took over as the company's CEO. She's now 86. Mrs. Gordon is vigorously engaged in the day-to-day operation of the company's business and strategic planning, according to a March SEC filing. In addition, Mrs. Gordon has advised the board that she has no present intention of retiring from her current positions as an officer and a director. There are continual questions about whether Tootsie Roll Industries will be gobbled up by a larger company, but Ellen Gordon, her late husband, and her father before her have been at the helm since the 1950s. Gordon and her 4 daughters own about 60% of the company. No Wall Street analysts cover Tootsie Roll Industries, in part because the company is so reticent. It doesn't hold investor conference calls, for instance. But in 2017, the activist investment firm Spruce Point Capital Management issued a strong sell recommendation on the company. Tootsie dates back to the early 1900s, and its brands are withering along with its core customers, the Spruce Point report said. Sales haven't grown in 6 years, and we estimate it is losing market share in North America. After waiting 2 months for a response, I finally got an email from the public relations firm that represents Tootsie Roll Industries. They answered 5 questions, informing me that the answers came from the CEO herself. About 200 people work at the Cambridge factory, making 26,500,000 pieces of candy a day. Of those, about 14,560,000 are individual Junior Mints. The Cambridge Brands factory is the world's only source of Junior Mints, Sugar Babies, and Charleston Chews, but it doesn't make Tootsie Rolls or Tootsie Pops. How is it that Cambridge Brands has continued to operate as everything else has closed down? The company has invested millions of dollars in automated packaging, processing lines, and materials handling equipment, and we will continue to do so, Gordon wrote. Why doesn't Cambridge Brands offer tours or even let the occasional reporter like me inside? As is typical in the manufacturing industry, Gordon explained, for food safety, proper sanitation, and hygiene, the facility operates a closed plant. Its neighbor on Massachusetts Avenue, the New England Confectionery Company, decamped from Cambridge in 2003, moving its plant to Revere. That company is in dire straits. It filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and an auction is scheduled for May. The company could be acquired by someone who wants to continue running it, or it could be sold for parts. Necco's former factory is now occupied by the Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research, a pharmaceutical research center that is now Cambridge's biggest private employer. That leaves Cambridge Brands as the last vestige of an industrial era when Cambridge made things, from railroad cars to carriages to soap to woven hoses to bolts. It still makes Junior Mints. How Cambridge Became the Life Sciences Capital. This was published in the Boston Globe, March 17, 2016. If you happen to wander through Kendall Square on a summer Saturday 4 decades ago, you might have encountered an open-air marketplace. You could have bought vintage clothing or a rock painted with President Gerald Ford's face. You might also have seen MIT and Harvard professors and students demonstrating some laboratory tools and talking about the potential of gene splicing. Nearby was an anti-gene splicing booth manned by a Harvard grad student, Scott Thatcher. The dueling information booths were part of a debate that sprang up in Cambridge in 1976 about the new field of recombinant DNA, the ability to blend genetic material from several sources and grow it inside a living organism. There was a sci-fi element to the discourse, Thatcher recalls, with politicians like then Cambridge Mayor Alfred Vellucci fretting about scientists creating new kinds of Frankenstein monsters. Thatcher says he felt at the time that there were reasons to be cautious about recombinant DNA research, and he was joined in that opinion by Nobel laureates like George Wald, who suggested that wide-open deserts rather than dense urban centers would be more appropriate for such research. The debates of 1976 marked the start of a 5-year period that shaped the local biotech landscape. If you've ever assumed, as I had, that biotech companies cluster in Cambridge only because they want to be close to Harvard and MIT, well, that's only part of the story. In June 1976, a newspaper article sounded the alarm about Harvard's plans to build a new lab with a higher level of safety and containment. The objective was to allow researchers to conduct experiments with recombinant DNA. Vellucci, a frequent jousting opponent of Harvard's, was outraged to learn about the university's plans from the newspaper. He chaired a hearing at Cambridge City Hall featuring researchers from Harvard and MIT and an official from the National Institutes of Health. Is it true that in the history of science, mistakes have been known to happen? Vellucci asked. Do scientists ever exercise poor judgment? Do they ever have accidents? A smattering of applause broke out in the packed hearing room. Vellucci hoped to pass a 2-year moratorium on gene splicing in Cambridge. Instead, the council passed a 3-month moratorium and created a board of 9 Cambridge citizens, including a nun and a nurse, to explore whether the work should be allowed, and if so, what safeguards would be necessary. A few days after the board was created, the pro and con tables showed up at the Kendall Square marketplace. At the time, says Philip Sharp, an MIT professor, Cambridge felt like a manufacturing town that had seen better days. He recalls being surrounded by candy, textile, and leather factories. Sharp hosted the Citizens Review Committee at MIT, explaining what the research scientists there planned to do. I think we built a relationship, he says. By early 1977, the Citizens Committee had proposed a framework to ensure that any DNA-related experiments were done under fairly stringent safety controls, and Cambridge became the first city in the world to regulate research using genetic material. That early creation of a clear regulatory structure led to the Swiss biotech company Biogen opening up a lab in the city in 1982. Sharp was a co-founder of the company. Mayor Vellucci even showed up for the ribbon cutting, declaring that he now had no fear of recombinant DNA as long as it paid taxes, according to a history of the era consensus from controversy. But in cities like Somerville and Boston, the atmosphere surrounding DNA research remained emotionally charged and politicized into the early 1980s. When a Harvard spinout, Genetics Institute, tried to set up an office in Somerville in 1981, a public hearing aired concerns about rats and roaches carrying newly invented organisms out of the labs and into a nearby supermarket. The 2 founding scientists just said, "Forget about this," says Gabe Schmergel, the company's longtime chief executive. When Genetics Institute instead moved into a mostly abandoned hospital building in Mission Hill, Ray Flynn, then a Boston city councilor, led a protest outside the building. He was running for mayor, and one of his platforms was to be against biotechnology, says Schmergel, who snuck out the back door to avoid an unpleasant confrontation. By contrast, Cambridge was willing to put out the welcome mat, Schmergel says. His company bought an old warehouse at Alewife and set up labs to develop drugs for cancer and hemophilia. When Genetics Institute was acquired by drug maker American Home Products in 1996, it had grown to about 1,200 employees in Cambridge and Andover. American Home Products eventually became part of Pfizer of New York. And as an aside, that Pfizer plant in Andover is now being used to make Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. Today, the largest private employer in Cambridge is Novartis, the Swiss biopharma company that opened a $600 million expansion of its research campus in December. And Biogen, depending on the day, has either the biggest or second biggest market capitalization of any Massachusetts company. Meanwhile, Somerville has no biotech cluster to speak of, though Mayor Joseph Curtatone has hustled for nearly a decade to create one. Our strategy is really a long-term play, Curtatone says. In 2011, one of Cambridge's big drug makers, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, was lured to Boston with an incentive package worth $60 million. Not many others have followed Vertex across the Charles River. Yes, Cambridge had the benefit of MIT and Harvard nudging it to create a permitting system for DNA experimentation, but it also had a major public immersion in the topic. And it started early, says Sharp, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993. That's an important lesson for elected officials regulating new fields like airborne drones, car sharing services, Airbnb rentals, or the newest scientific frontier, gene editing. Move too slowly or react out of fear, and the economic repercussions can endure for decades. 40 years after the pro and anti-DNA research tables showed up in Kendall Square, I rang up Scott Thatcher. Today he runs a pharmaceutical startup in San Diego. I asked if he'd been back to Cambridge recently to see the growth of the biotech cluster, and he said that he had. This time, instead of manning a table, he was making a pitch for funding to one of the city's many biotech venture capital firms. I chucked it all and became a Turker. This was published in the Boston Globe, April 1st, 2012. A few weeks ago, tired of the niggling questions of editors and the constant press of deadlines, I decided to chuck it all and become a Turker. What's a Turker? It's someone who performs small tasks that can't be automated. Once you sign up on the Mechanical Turk website, operated by Amazon.com, you can choose from an array of jobs that might take a few seconds or a few hours. You can translate documents from Tibetan to English, fill out surveys for academic researchers, or transcribe a 71-minute lecture about gastroenterology. How's the pay? That last task offered $2.85 for work that would likely take several hours. I was curious about Mechanical Turk because it's just one of many websites cropping up that allow work to be farmed out globally, often to the lowest bidder. The phenomenon is sometimes called micro-labor. Looked at collectively, the sites, some with links to Boston, seem harbingers of a new wave of outsourcing that will allow companies and individuals to get things done more cheaply and efficiently than before. The flip side, however, is that they seem destined to delete some number of full-time jobs, while creating more freelancers forced to scramble for income while paying for their own health insurance and trying to save for retirement. Launching my career as a micro-laborer involved no interviews or drug tests, and it took all of 10 minutes. I signed up for Amazon's payment service, so the money I earned could be funneled into my bank account. Then I began sorting through jobs posted on the site. $2 to write an interesting and well-written 1,000-word article on an assigned topic? Too much like my job as a newspaper columnist at radically reduced pay. I quickly earned 4 cents for looking at 5 images and deciding whether some descriptive terms that had been applied to them were accurate. The images were fun to peruse. Pictures of Fiats being shipped from Italy, and photos of Johnny Weissmuller, who starred in the Tarzan movies of the 1930s. I earned 7 cents by looking at some people's LinkedIn profiles and determining which job category the person best fit, then earned a whopping $4 for filling out a survey about leisure activities I enjoy. But I also had to give my micro-employer, Hammerhead Labs, access to my Facebook and Foursquare accounts, which made me a little nervous. At the end of my first 2 hours as a Turker, I had earned $4.37. But I also completed several jobs that hadn't been approved by the people who posted them. Assigners get to decide whether a task has been completed satisfactorily before releasing payment. My LinkedIn categorization project was rejected, with an admonishment to, quote, work more carefully in the future, end quote. Mechanical Turk is just one example of the new wave of outsourcing. If you're a cosmetics company that would like to set up a blog with a constant stream of beauty tips, you can use Boston-based Skyward to hire writers. Skyward Chief Executive Tom Gerace says that over the last month, 1,200 writers produced 13,500 articles and blog posts for clients. The per-article payment ranges from $13 on the low end to $200 on the high end. But Skyward sometimes asks writers to produce an article for free and pays them based on how often it is viewed, for instance, $3.50 for every 500 views. GrabCAD, a startup with operations in Cambridge and Estonia, allows mechanical engineers to create online profiles that help companies find them and potentially supply them with projects. The site also runs challenges where engineers can show off their best design solution for a given product or part and potentially win anywhere from $50 to $5,000, as well as a contract for future work. TaskRabbit got its start in Cambridge but is now headquartered in San Francisco. The company has assembled a network of errand runners in 9 cities to do things like pick up a desk at IKEA and assemble it in a company's office. Founder Leah Buskey prefers to call what they do micro-entrepreneurship, not micro-labor. With nearly 13 million Americans looking for work, we are providing an alternative to the traditional 9-to-5 job, she says. Our TaskRabbits can make money and build their own business on their own terms. I spoke with one Cambridge TaskRabbit last week just after he finished a job in Wellesley installing a sink drain. Mark Hedges said he could earn $500 in a pretty good week doing handyman jobs through TaskRabbit. This gives me flexibility, and I like dealing one-on-one with customers, Hedges says. But he previously worked as a union mason until the 2008 recession, and says his freelance lifestyle is not at all comparable to working union construction. There, he says, you had an annuity and health insurance. For companies and individuals, getting more work done while spending less is always good, but I do think these services will inevitably erode full-time jobs. Ofer Sharon, a professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management, says the sites can be beneficial for a small percent of workers with rare skills who now have access to a global pool of employers, or workers living in very low-cost places. But the overall impact, he predicts, will create a global race for the bottom, in which companies can have a global labor pool of professionals competing against each other on the basis of wages. So far, I've earned $8.06 for almost 4 hours of turking. That would explain why I'm back to writing this column. I'm holding tight to this gig, at least until my editor figures out how to use Mechanical Turk to assign it to someone who'll do it better and cheaper.